Welcome back. Now, the National Energy Regulator of South Africa, that's NERSA, is inviting members of the public to comment on Eskom's latest application for additional revenue. Now, NERSA says it will use due regulatory processes to come to a determination on the 8.4 billion rand which Eskom expects to be added to next year's electricity tariffs. Now, the amount pertains to Eskom's Regulatory Clearing Account, that's the RCA balance for the 2020 financial year in accordance with the multi-year price determination methodology. RCA is the reconciliation of the difference between Eskom's estimated revenue and the actual revenue. And in February, the Gauteng High Court ordered that an amount of 10 billion rand be added to Eskom's allowable revenue to be recovered from customers in the 2021-2022 financial year. Nhlanhla Gumede is the regulator responsible for electricity regulation at NERSA, and he joins us now for more clarity on this matter. Mr. Gumede, thanks for your time. Welcome to Morning Live.
Thank you, Sakina.
So this amount that we're talking about pertains to Eskom's Regulatory Clearing Account, the RCA, and that balance for 2020 in accordance with the multi-year price determination methodology. So if you can please just start by explaining to us and to the viewers, what is the RCA and what exactly is this all about?
Okay, basically just to remind the viewers is that our pricing system is one that projects into the future. It's based on estimates. So these particular estimates were made in terms of the NYPD4 methodology, were made for the year financial year 1920, year 2021, and 21-22. In fact, we are now in the last year of the NYPD4. But because it's all based on projections, some of those projections that are made, though those estimates are realized, others are not realized. But the whole system works on saying that Eskom, firstly, the assumption is that the costs that are incurred by Eskom are prudent. And based on those prudently incurred costs, we then say what should be the revenue that would be required that will cover those costs, only the prudent costs. And then those revenues are then translated into tariffs. So that is how the system actually works. But what then happens is, because it's based on projections, is that some of those projections that are made are not actually realized. Be it, for instance, the amount of primary energy that is consumed, or the prices that those primary energies are bought at, or it could be other costs, including, for instance, the pass-through costs like the cost of IPPs, and it would also include costs like cost of capital and so forth. But of course, the greatest of all is the sales. That because whatever that we project is based on an estimate of what the sales are going to be. That is the sales excluding any of the load shedding that may be coming from Eskom. So what then happens at the end of a period, like this particular one, this RCA relates to the year 2019 and 2020. This RCA then looks at the actual costs that were incurred by Eskom for that particular year, and then it says, did they over-recover or under-recover?
And you speak about projections that you make, and hence there could be an over or under recovery. But if we think about what actually goes on, like right now, it's winter, it's cold, there's a lot of load shedding about, and sometimes Eskom has to burn fuel, burn diesel to keep the lights on. So all of those costs, are some of those factored into these amounts that factor into the RCA?
Yes, actually all of the costs are affected, but the one thing that I think the key word here is prudent. So for instance, in the NYPD4, there were certain assumptions, for instance, in terms of the EAF, the plant availabilities. That is, for instance, that the plants were going to be available for 65% or 70% of the time. So if the plants are actually available for less than that, and the belief is that it is something that was well within Eskom's control, then we would not necessarily punish the consumers for having to actually foot these additional, the cost of running, for instance, the diesel-fired generators, which cost a whole lot more. I mean, I always want to emphasize this, that it costs about 4 rand per kilowatt hour to produce electricity via diesel, 4 rand per kilowatt hour. But unfortunately, it's one of those dispatchable electricity generators that we have. Now, the challenge with all of that is that the question that we have to ask Eskom is that, did you maintain your plants properly? Did you operate your plants properly? Did you do all of these things properly such that the lower cost plants, which are the ones on the basis of which these prices are set, is that did you actually use those prudently? If the answer to that is no, then clearly any of the costs that you then incur for running these diesel generators is to your account. However, if the answer to that is yes, of course, then if those costs were prudently incurred, then clearly it's then fair that the consumers would then have to compensate Eskom for that.
But what would constitute prudent in the current situation, given that there are almost permanent breakdowns at some of these entities under Eskom's control? And therefore, if they break down, Eskom says, well, they haven't been maintained. These are old infrastructure, and therefore it will break down. So is there ever a time in this instance where it would not be prudent?
Well, let's put it this way. The way I always put it is that, if you deploy an incorrect equipment to do a particular job, clearly that equipment will not last. So we have a particular changing demand pattern in South Africa, which unfortunately has to be matched with an appropriate supply pattern. So what's happening is that a lot of these I know that people always attribute a breakup of mechanical units to just age. Unfortunately, that's not always 100% correct. If you're using a machine properly for what it was intended for, it should not break as often as it does. So what we're looking at right now, and it's something that I think we would be able to come back to the consumers and engage with in about 2 or 3 months' time. It's this matching, such that we have to ask ourselves the right question. Are we matching the right equipment to the right demand? And also, are we charging the right price for that equipment that's being used for that demand? So that's the challenge that at the moment we are facing.
And of course, the nub of the matter is all of these costs, if there is an under-recovery, is passed on to the consumer. So you and we are going to pay for whatever it is. So to that point, and just on a matter of clarity, this 8.4 billion rand, is this a new application, or does it relate to the Gauteng High Court order in February that 10 billion rand should be added to Eskom's allowable revenue?
Well, the 10 billion rands was applied to the 21-22 final numbers. That is the numbers that were actually implemented this year. This 8.4 is an additional RCA. It clears, it's a balancing amount that balances the amounts that were estimated for the MYPD year 2019-2020. So it is a new amount, is over and above any of the amounts that have been previously approved by NERSA, which may be implemented also, which were agreed to that they were going to be implemented later. So it is an additional amount, Sakina.
So speaking of the multi-year price determination methodology, this of course provides Eskom tariffs to be determined by NERSA at intervals of 3 to 5 years. Why is that the case? Why do you determine that on a 3-year basis instead of an annual basis?
The original thinking was one of coming up with price stability, because you need price stability both as the as the investor, of course, in electricity, you need to know what the price path is going to look like. But in the main, is for the users, especially industrial users, because when they make investments in a country, they need to see where the price of electricity, especially for those sectors where electricity plays a major role. So, for instance, we're talking about industries here which may have, as a percentage of cost, of cash costs, up to 40% of electricity being a cost. So those people need to see what is the trajectory for electricity into the future. So the thinking was therefore that we need to be able to come up with a multi-year pricing determination, which will then give some kind of price stability. Unfortunately, because of the RCA as well, that has tended to not necessarily result in that price stability that was intended. So the methodology itself is one that is not in the law. The law merely says you need to come up with a tariff, a way of setting a tariff or a revenue that will make sure that a prudent or an efficient licensee will recover all its costs. But it's always, of course, because you've got demand and supply, and you need to make sure that whatever you produce, somebody can buy. You need to make sure that both parties actually can see the price path and be able to invest on that price path.
That takes care of the investor, but what about ordinary consumers, household consumers, for example? Because doesn't that amount then accumulate and ends up, in the end, the consumer has a higher bill to actually service?
As I say, the price is meant to be a signal. The signal goes both ways. It goes towards the investor, but it also goes towards, it's a signal to the consumer. For instance, South Africa, we've traditionally used electricity for everything. In fact, it makes absolutely no sense that we are cooking and heating, both water and space heating, that we're using electricity for that. It's the most inefficient way of doing things. Yes, we may not have gas so much in South Africa, but we do have potential gas sources, and some of them is LPG, but other gas sources from neighbors and places like that. We should be using, for thermal applications, we should not be using electricity. So what it does is that it's meant to give a potential signal to you and I, Sekina, that says, okay, if this is the price path in terms of the cost of electricity, does it make sense for me to then change my stove and go into and use a gas stove? Because if I do my own calculations in terms of the amount of money I'm going to be spending on energy to cook, it's actually far more efficient to cook with gas. Now, so it's meant to be a price signal, not just for the investor, but a price signal to all of the consumers in South Africa.
I'm sure you've heard that somehow that doesn't seem to make a difference in the long run. You buy gas heaters, you buy a gas stove, and your electricity account just seems to remain the same for whatever reason. But that aside, Mr. Gumede, last year NERSA approved Eskom's 13.3 billion rand regulatory clearing account. And of course, that shortfall on Eskom's books, as we said, is to be recovered from the public. Yet, as the regulator, you acknowledge that there are certain governance failures at Eskom. So why is it fair? How is it fair that Eskom is granted an RCA despite these governance failures? I mean, as the public, is that fair on the public?
The truth of the matter is the regulator is obliged to firstly verify that the costs that have been incurred are prudent. The challenge, I think, that the regulator has faced is that we've got a number of other investigations, whether it's the SIUs, we have a number of investigations that are actually ongoing at the moment, that it makes very little sense that the NERSA would run something parallel. That it's useful to then wait until some of these investigations come to an end, and the results that are drawn from that can then be incorporated and verified. So, for instance, it is also not true that Eskom may have applied for 8.4 billion, But it is not true that Eskom will just automatically be granted the 8.4 billion, because firstly, we still need to actually verify the prudency of those costs that they have put in, including if there are revenue shortages. We need to be able to see to what extent were those revenue shortfalls actually as a result of Eskom's actions itself. That's one part. But in terms of the costs, is that, yes, we are hoping that at some point a number of these investigations will come to a close, and the amounts that are due back to the consumers are clearly outlined, and those monies will then be passed straight back to the consumers, because in terms of as part of these RCAs, they will then be accounted for in terms of the RCAs.
But pass back how? Because if NERSA's calculation of RCA considers whether Eskom actually has been efficient and prudent in its procurement processes, among other things, and the shortfall is, say, as an example, due to Eskom's overspending during a specific period, why must the public be held responsible for the cost of Eskom's financial mismanagement during the years? If we look at the malfeasance that has taken place at Eskom, all the wrong things that we hear about, that's reported about, why should we be paying for that as the public?
We shouldn't, Sakina.
But we are.
The issue is that
the
problem with the law, but the problem with the law, Sakina, is that it's not what we know, is what we can prove. Because at the end of the day, our decisions as the regulator are actually administrative. So in the event that the decisions we make are not based on facts and evidence...
No, but let me interject, anyway. Please, Mr. Gumede. The evidence is there. You have to look at Eskom's financial statements as a parting point to see where the malfeasance, the maladministration is taking place. We've been reporting about the power stations, Kusile, Medupi, that have overrun in costs for how many years? How is that the public's fault? Why should the public have to carry that cost? Why?
To the extent to which any of the malfeasance has been proven, Sakina, those costs are then deducted from the cost or from the numbers that are presented by Eskom. Unfortunately, the problem is that some of those numbers, it's just something that has been allegations by certain parties, but nothing has been proved. It's only once the numbers have been proved, Sakina, this is the duty of the regulator, is to then recognize those, deduct them from either is the capital that Eskom is projecting, or the revenue requirements that Eskom is asking for. That is the duty of the regulator.
But Mr. Gumede, Kusile, Medupi again, we're talking about hundreds of millions of rands in cost overruns. Eskom has admitted that. They've admitted that there were things like, diagrams and construction as per diagrams that were wrong, that did not fit whatever structure it was meant to fit into, and such engineering glitches that have taken place. Why is that not passed on to whoever that tender was awarded to? Why is that not passed on to anyone other than the consumer? Why should the consumer pay for that inefficiency? Why?
We shouldn't pay for that, Sakina, and that's why, for instance, when we hold these public hearings, to the extent to which perhaps the regulator may have overlooked certain costs or certain information that which may be public, to the extent that may be the fact, Sakina, those facts are then incorporated in the decision. So if now certain facts have come to the fore in respect of some of those cost overruns, those cost overruns will then be taken out of the regulated asset base, or if it's operating costs, those costs will then be taken out of those operating costs. That is the duty of the regulator.
Well, we have to leave it there, Mr. Gumede, unfortunately, but I would have loved to continue, but hopefully we'll have opportunity again. Mr. Nhlanhla Gumede is the regulator responsible for electricity regulation at NERSA, talking to us about Eskom's 8.4 billion rand application to the regulator. And NERSA has opened for members of the public and stakeholders who wish to attend or present their views at any of the public hearings to submit their request, and we'll give you those details after the 8 o'clock news, because you are actually in a position right now to comment on this.
All right, we've got to say goodbye, though. It is 8 o'clock, so thanks for watching.